we are, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Mary Renee, and as Sharon has just introduced, I'm from ACHIA. It's the Aboriginal Community Housing, and we're a part of the 3 peaks that's helping out with the Cohorts cluster. I'm a proud Kamilaroi woman, mother, grandmother and wife. I am honoured to open this trauma-informed community of practice session by acknowledging our elders, past and present, the emerging who continue to carry the torch of responsibility and respectfulness. This is caring and sharing. Cultural practices taught by parents and grandparents for generations was to help to identify where and how to deal with stressful and traumatic situations.
And I don't know that they're going to.
Couple of the key things that they taught was it starts with silence and it starts with time out. This learning was showcased throughout times of sorry business, and communities would shut down for 2 weeks. This meant no music, no gambling, no drinking, no going out. You weren't allowed to visit others. You had to stay home. It was a time to help you process what was going on within, your feelings and your thoughts, to help your body and your mind, your spirit, to be able to rest and to heal. It was also a way of showing others, individuals, respect for them and their situation that they were going through. Now I'm much older, after watching that for many, many years. I'm not going to say my age. I still practice these ways for myself and for others. I've found there's other places other than home that I can go to get the help that I need. And one of the other places is by the river. The river system, the flowing waters, it helps with heavy thoughts and feelings. That helps me to be able to then work with professionals to be able to articulate what's going on inside. This is so there's no misunderstanding of a reaction that shouldn't, that is not needed, a misdiagnosis in any way. After spending times on the banks, I'm able to come back and, like I said, just be able to speak about it without, being heavy-minded and caught into too many thoughts. I'm currently off country and I'm living amongst the Barkindji people in Kenya. This proud race still practices their native language and their medicines and their beliefs. Coming here has brought back remembrance of some old ways and practices taught to me by my parents and by my grandparents. It's all overflowed into the work that I have done for many years. And with that, I would like to say that and pay recognition to this year's NAIDOC theme, which is for our elders. As across every generation, our elders have played and continue to play an important role in our communities and our lives and our families. I also want to acknowledge everyone online today and especially any First Nations people attending. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary. That was a great privilege to have you open our CoP series with a truly amazing acknowledgement of country. Thank you for sharing that with us. Sorry, I'm a bit emotional. So I'll just get rolling now to sort of stop that emotion. Apologies for that. So today's presentation is the first in our new core and cluster focus series in partnership with Homelessness New South Wales and ACHIA. This series contributes to our joint program of engagement and sector capacity building to support a successful core and cluster procurement. So DV New South Wales' role within this partnership is to provide the core and cluster program with a focus on DFV specialist service delivery, with successful tenderers needing to align their service delivery with the newly launched second edition of the DV New South Wales Good Practice Guidelines. The foundational concepts and principles in the Good Practice Guidelines specify and support domestic and family violence informed and trauma informed specialist practice and service delivery. So for the core and cluster model of crisis accommodation service delivery, trauma informed begins with the built environment. Trauma-informed practice begins with the built environment. The core and cluster model of crisis accommodation for women and children experiencing domestic and family violence provides the sector the opportunity to respond to women's and children's needs literally from the ground up. And in this 50th year anniversary year of the women's refuge movement, it seems very fitting that core and cluster is being implemented. Trauma-informed design amongst built environment fields has emerged alongside the trauma-informed care movement. So designers who incorporate trauma-informed design strategies recognise the emotional and physical impact that the experience of domestic and family violence has on women and children, and they take intentional steps to mitigate these traumatising negative experiences utilising trauma-informed design principles. So today we have with us industry expert and design architect Samantha Donnelly. She will discuss the principles of trauma-informed design, including strategies of interior and architectural design used to reduce women and children's experiences of stress in the refuge environment, and including contributing to potentially reducing the likelihood of re-traumatisation. Sam has indicated that she's happy to field questions as the presentation flows. So in this way, please, we encourage you to pop your questions in the chat, and I will put those questions to Sam as we interact with the presentation. So welcome, Sam. We're very excited to have you here with us today, presenting on your very special research and work on trauma-informed design. And I'll say over to you.
Thanks, Sharon, and thank you, Mary, for the acknowledgement and the welcome. I'm really honoured to be able to speak with you all today as experts in the field of domestic and family violence. It's to you that I have to acknowledge great thanks for sharing your experiences as experts in my work as an architect. I've spoken with many of you in the time of working on my PhD, and I've learned so much. So I need to acknowledge and say thank you first before I start, because it's because of a lot of you that this work has been possible. I'm an architect by training. I graduated from the University of Adelaide, and I am currently working at UTS as an academic, teaching students in interior and architecture courses. I'm a feminist, and I really am invested and passionate about teaching students about the value of designing and creating equitable and quality buildings and environments for women and children, and to start to think about how the environment plays into that, and how as feminists we have a lot of power in changing the way that we live and operate in the world. I first started working on women's refuges in practice. I had a job in the northern suburbs of Sydney where I was asked to remove a kitchen from one of the refuges where a lot of the women were having arguments about who was cooking toast at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that was kind of my introduction into this amazing, complicated world of refuges. And I completely fell in love from the minute I walked into the refuge, and I understood that this was my kind of puzzle. This was the thing that would keep me up at night and kind of make my practice actually make sense. So I've put together a presentation today that talks about trauma-informed design, because I'm deeply committed to ensuring that the buildings that get delivered to you as a service are working for you and not making assumptions about the practices that you work with. And I'm worried that people are calling things trauma-informed that aren't trauma-informed. And I think we really need to work with you more closely as a service to make sure that the buildings that you're getting are actually working in the way that they're meant to. So I've put together a presentation, and hopefully it will spark some conversation in that direction. So today we're talking about core and cluster accommodation specifically because this is the practice that we're moving towards in terms of trauma-informed practice working better in a core and cluster model building. And I'm sure you already know the difference. The shared model of accommodation has created a lot of difficulties in the past, where shared spaces tend to really exacerbate traumas for different families at different stages of their recovery process, and also for staff it causes a lot of issues. So keeping in mind that we'll be looking at core and cluster type buildings, we'll work through what trauma-informed practice means in the built environment. So trauma is an extreme stressor that overwhelms the capacity to cope and has lasting adverse effects on physical, social, emotional and spiritual well-being, which you'll all be well aware of. Trauma lives and works through the body, so there's a bodily reaction to trauma, and therefore the built environment is integral to how one experiences trauma. Trauma is nearly universal experience of people with mental health and substance use disorders, those who have experienced violence, those living in poverty, and those who have experienced homelessness. So that describes kind of the refuge population, and women and children who are coming into refuge have often experienced one or many of those issues. The body will signal often before the mind thinks I'm in danger. So there's the body is much quicker to register trauma before the mind is. And it often dispatches a physiological response of fight, flight, freeze or fawn. And so these within a spatial context are quite interesting to think about, how the environment around the body can actually start to mediate those reactions. Architecture can either exacerbate or calm the body's response to stresses. And by modulating the way that the built environment works, we can actually start to address these reactions. So self-contained units within core and cluster model refuges automatically start to increase the privacy and calm that families need to be able to recover. Many traumatized people bond more quickly to familiar inanimate objects than other people. So I find this really interesting, that people will bond to a building more quickly than they'll bond to a person. But it makes sense when you think about how trust is really affected when somebody's experienced trauma. So trusting something that's inanimate is kind of a really immediate response. So architecture in that sense has the opportunity to be the first point of contact to cultivate safety and connection. So thinking about the entry point and that sense of feeling like you can trust where you're going in a refuge scenario is really important. So the way that the entry works and the setup of how the building welcomes people, and that includes both staff and residents, is a really important kind of design problem. So as designers, architects and built environment experts, we need to respond to, work alongside, check in with service providers to evaluate design solutions. And in that, I mean that we need to work with you from the beginning. We need to understand what your needs are as a service, and every service that I've interviewed so far has been different in kind of spectacular ways. So we can't just assume that a one-size refuge fits all. And that's something I think that the government needs to understand in greater detail. As built environment specialists, we've got a responsibility to go beyond shelter. We understand that shelter is not enough. So we need to work with you to understand what healing and wellbeing means. Trauma-informed practice also applies to design conversations. So we need to be trauma-informed in the way that we talk to people, the way that we listen to you, acknowledge and ask for permission in what we design. Trauma-informed practices are based on a series of principles. So the physical environment affects an individual's sense of identity, worth, dignity and empowerment. And keeping in mind this is a really big thing in the staff, in the way that staff are treated within a building. So a sense of identity and worth is as important for staff as it is for residents. Physical environment has an impact on attitude, mood and behaviour, physiology and emotional state. So it has all these kind of layers of effect. And the built and landscaped environments can help resist re-traumatisation. Often I think we privilege the built environment over the landscaped environment. And I think this is a really, really big problem and something that when you start to work with trauma, the benefits of landscape and even views to the landscape start to come to the fore. Some of the really forefront research in trauma-informed design is coming from the States, and they've got a series of diagrams showing the 3 C's. They often talk about the 3 C's of trauma-informed design. So they address comfort, community and choice as the 3 main objectives of trauma-informed design. And within these, there are a series of environmental contexts, lived experience and cultural context. So within the way that they address trauma-informed design, there's already a cultural context embedded, which I think is one of the really important things in an Australian context, because we're dealing with multicultural situations, particularly in refuges, all the time. So in my research, I've been trying to work out the connections that occur between trauma-informed practice, which is what practitioners are already working within, and then trauma-informed design principles, which is what designers need to start to link to the trauma-informed practice principles. And you can see here along the bottom of the established principles that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association in the States have established, so safety, trust, transparency. And at the top are a series of trauma-informed design principles that have been cited in literature that are very closely related, but in parts they kind of are more specifically addressing the built environment. So things like connection relates to collaboration, empowerment within the built environment relates to empowerment, voice and choice. And there's things like joy, beauty and meaning that you can clearly see in built environments, but they're more difficult to understand within a trauma-informed practice. But in the things that I've been reading, it seems to really make sense when you start to look at cultural, historical and gender issues. Those ideas of dignity, self-esteem, beauty and meaning start to correlate in really interesting ways in the built environment. So I've been working to try and understand how to really clearly link design principles to trauma-informed practice principles, address the broad goal of trauma-informed, the ways that we can support a wraparound recovery environment that includes built environment, landscape, along with training, therapies and other support activities for people in need. It also supports those working with trauma-informed practice to prevent burnout and vicarious trauma, which are a serious issues which don't seem to be addressed in tandem with the trauma-informed practice that's working with residents. So the first principles I'd like to talk about today are the idea of providing an environment that's safe but inviting. So that idea that we were talking about just before, about the idea of the entry and the way that an entry kind of welcomes people in, but immediately makes them feel safe and calm, can be mediated through things like natural daylighting. Good view lines are really important so that you can see where you're moving into, so that you can be prepared. And also that you can see what other people are in the environment, so you're not kind of being surprised or lost in that entry sequence. Reinforcing the sense of stable and consistent support for individuals. Having somebody greet you at the entry is sometimes very important, or knowing where you go. So the idea of wayfinding and knowing where you can go to get help once you come into a building is important. So that can really easily be mitigated by good design and clear wayfinding and making buildings really simple to read, which I think it's not a given in a lot of architectural projects. Sometimes it's more complicated than it needs to be. And landscape can play a really big role in kind of addressing those layered entry sequences. This is about engaging the individual actively in a dynamic multi-sensory environment. So often we think about trauma-informed design as trying to calm people down and make sure that there are no triggers, but sometimes this creates a really dull and non-participatory environment. So it's important to make an environment that is multi-sensory, so that you get the sense of knowing the place that you are. Being able to feel the sunlight or feel a breeze is really important, so that you feel a connection with the natural world. Or being able to kind of read what time of day it is by seeing outside a window. So the dynamic multisensory environment is an important thing to integrate. It doesn't necessarily mean that the environment has to be the interactive, but it needs to connect to people and activities in a really kind of controlled way. The third idea is to promote a sense of community and collaboration. So often people who are coming into refuge have been isolated and have had a lot of their intimate connections and connections to family broken. So the refuge is a place where creating really safe connections and rebuilding their sense of community can happen in a really careful and considered way. It's important to provide a sense of choice, so that people who are introduced to a new community can make choices about how much and when they want to socialise. And another idea in this is that you provide opportunities for individuals to demonstrate self-reliance. So one of these ideas is that there's a place where you can allow people to make coffee, or make themselves a cup of tea, so that they can be self-reliant and they can look after their children, and they can do things for themselves. They're not continuously relying on somebody else to help them. So this builds up a sense of self-confidence and awareness. The fourth idea is one that is often cited in literature, and this is usually the most talked about thing in trauma-informed design, is reducing adverse stimuli and triggers. So things like really, people talk about violent colours or really kind of overstimulating patterns being not trauma-informed. And things like textures seem to be very important, particularly when we're talking about sensory playgrounds and interiors. But I would caution that's coming from a very white privileged area of research. I think we really need to do a lot more asking and listening into how cultural colours and cultural patterns can be integrated to start to create environments that are more responsive to the different types of cultures that are coming through. There are things like environmental stresses, noise and crowding. Noise is a really big, is an issue that's complained about throughout refuges, both by staff and residents. So noise does impact people quite a lot. But it doesn't mean that you need to create silent environments. Having people around you can often make you feel a lot more safe, but it's managing and controlling the types of noise that you can deal with. Crowding is another thing, but also triggers can be mares. So good storage can be a really simple solution to creating an environment that's calm and ordered and has a sense of purpose about it. And things like flickering lights and good lighting is another thing that I think design experts need to be really aware of. So sometimes it's not necessarily about the amount of space or the types of space. Sometimes a room can be immediately improved by providing much better lighting and control of lighting, so that different people using the space have more control about the types of lighting that they need. We've talked a little about this already, designing for cultural, historical and gender-based safety. So women's safety is often quite different to a male sense of safety. So designing for women's safety is quite specific, and you need to check in with the different types of safety that might be required for children compared to women. Different cultures have different expectations, and intergenerational trauma needs to be considered. Privacy and confidentiality, likewise. People have different expectations of what a private space means. And private spaces are definitely not rooms with closed doors. Often the women coming into refuge have experienced being locked away for long periods of time. So creating a sense of privacy sometimes means having an open space or a place that they understand that they can escape from. There are a lot of conversations that happen in refuge that need to be confidential. So providing spaces that staff can work more effectively with each other to talk through situations, but also talking with residents, and for residents to be able to talk to each other in confidential spaces, both in the landscape and in the refuge buildings themselves, are important to consider. And finally, the reinforcing an individual's sense of personal identity and ownership is important. So creating spaces where individuals have the kind of agency to be able to move things around, that they can hang pictures up in their rooms if they want to, have photographs of their family if they need them, and create a sense that they're at home, even though it's a temporary home while they're there. Same with the staff areas, having spaces that the staff can actually create a comfortable space that they can work in and own is important for staff to be able to come back to. And providing an opportunity for choice. So instead of having the standard kind of conference rooms and the rooms that are consultation rooms where you've only got one way of talking to somebody, and that's often across a desk, which creates a real sense of kind of hierarchy and not working equally. Creating spaces where people can sit together and talk together without a sense of hierarchy, and conference rooms where maybe you can sit to the side, where you don't have to sit at the conference table, but you're not being excluded. So they're really easy ways to kind of just reorganize the spaces, rather than, they're not expensive fixes, they're actually ways that can be designed into the building so that there are different ways of operating that aren't traditional. So questions for the design team, I think, should be about what assumptions and stereotypes and biases influence our understanding of those who live and work in refuge. So we come to these projects with a series of assumptions, and I think that's where, when we're talking to refuge providers, we need to ask a lot more questions and listen a lot more before we start to make decisions about what would be a good trauma-informed space. We need to ask whether trauma-informed principles are integrated at multiple scales. So the trauma-informed principles can work at an organisational level as well as, at the level of a room or a personal space. We need to think about real and perceived safety. So having a good door is one thing, but also having a perceived sense of safety. So good sight lines, making sure that children are safe. How do we ensure that through our design practices? And then how are identities, culture, traditions, and historical events integrated? These are things that can be integrated in the ways that we fit out our spaces with different types of furniture, whether we allow for people to be able to sit on the floor, things that acknowledge people's cultural traditions. Does the built environment respond respectfully to community and landscape? Do we privilege building over landscape, or does landscape actually become kind of an outside room where we can do a lot better work. And how does the burden of maintenance, how is it reduced through design? So the burden of maintaining the buildings and the landscape often falls to the service providers without asking them if they're prepared to do that. So I think it's a really important thing to think about how we reduce the this kind of load that we often don't think about as we're designing. So I propose a call to action. So becoming trauma informed is a radical act. It's pushing against the traditional ways of designing. As we design with, by, and for, we have to continue to do transformational relational work and not work that's transactional and extractive. Some of the problems are that these trauma-informed principles act like a checklist, which I think is dangerous in the sense that if we check the list, then we've done our job. I don't think that's always the case, and often it's not evaluated in a way that can be beneficial to the people that it's meant to be serving. And we also need to have dramatic shifts in our education and training. We need to actually work at this at an organisational level, in academia and in practice, and create care models that allow us to understand people and their environments ethically, responsibly, and holistically. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Dan, thank you. Thank you so much. That was excellent, of course. Wonderful and terrific quality slides. And so I've asked people to start popping questions in the chat for you to respond to. But while we wait for them to do that, if people are comfortable, I might get the ball rolling with a question for you, Sam, in terms of your background. So, as a researcher, as a researcher now, but obviously as well as a design architect in practice, can you tell us a bit about your research and maybe share with us how and where your commitment to this area began, which I know you mentioned right at the beginning of that experience at the communal refuge, but could you maybe tell us a bit more about that and about the current research that you're working on, because I know it to be fascinating.
Yeah, sure, Sharon. So as an architect, I started working in small practices and large practices, and always had this sense of being really, really uncomfortable with the sense of privilege where clients who had a lot of money were the only ones who got, a designed environment. And it always just sat really badly with the way that I thought if, good design could benefit everybody, then why couldn't people who had very little funds access good design more so than people with heaps of cash? And I ended up teaching out of frustration, because I thought there must be different ways of addressing the way that good design works. And then I eventually found my way into a practice that it was a not-for-profit practice, and it was working for organisations that were dealing with welfare and social housing, which worked much better. But it was then that I started finding that women's refuges were one of the most underprivileged spaces, and the fact that they were never designed. Women were living in these spaces that were leftover housing stock. They were often really old buildings that weren't maintained. They're really difficult to maintain and live in. They were designed for one family, but there would often be 6 or 7 families living in there with a body of staff that were also trying to work in there. So for me, the idea that these environments could be they could be designed so much better to work for the people who needed them. And I didn't kind of get then, the kind of depths of the psychological issues that people were dealing with in these spaces. So I think that's been a really interesting part of my research, is understanding how the built environment and mental health work really closely together. But another aspect of the research is this relationship that builds up between women working in the sector and my research. I think a lot of architects work in isolation, and they kind of do the design and then deliver it to clients. But I think that has always been a really big issue where the architect is the boss or makes decisions on behalf of somebody else. And I think that doesn't work very well in most situations. And I think in the domestic and violent service sector, it is about working together. And I really appreciate the way that you approach buildings. And I think just watching some of the ways that service providers work in built environments has been fascinating. You're all interior architects more than most interior architects. You know how to set up a room, you know how to fit things in, you know how to stop children from kind of completely trashing a place, you know, through the way that you design where you work. And I think I've learned an incredible amount from watching you work.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so maybe can I encourage people to ask their questions on screen if they would like to. Sam's here for us to respond. This is fascinating stuff. It's new to a lot of us, and it's very timely and kind of wonderful that we've got to this place where we are able to engage in these principles and good practice guideline principles, more generally speaking, in terms of responding to women and children and in terms of gender-informed and trauma-informed practice. So while we wait for people to have a think about questions that they might want to ask, maybe I'll ask another one. Here we go, we've got one. Excellent. So how do we navigate constraints from apartment design guide or DCP/LEP to ensure we still achieve trauma-informed design? That's a big one.
I think a lot of the trauma-informed design principles are basically good practice design. You know, they should be universal design principles. So trauma-informed design doesn't necessarily mean, like, it doesn't necessarily mean going outside apartment design guidelines necessarily. I think access is a really big issue for a lot of people, and being able to mobilise around spaces, but that should have already been addressed in any good design. So I think there are always pushback mechanisms within those DCP and LEP requirements, and I think based on what you would know about trauma-informed design, I think that's a good basis for saying to councils, look, I acknowledge that you expect this to happen or this type of lighting, but I really need to have, in terms of the people who are living here, this is what I need in this project. So there are built-in ways to resist some of the poor controls that are in some of the council regulations.
Thank you, and it highlights the need for broader-based trauma-informed information and information sharing training as well, doesn't it? And it fits with an earlier comment around the safe rooms at local courts needing to be better designed in terms of being multifunctional spaces that are sympathetic to clients and the staff and the kids and so forth. So yes, that I think that responds to that. But please feel free, that the asker of that or the maker of that comment, please feel free to pop something else in if you'd like some more information about that. So we're being asked about if community housing are having trauma-informed design seminars, which would assist the sector. So do you want to respond to that, or do you want me to?
That's a really good idea. Yeah. I think Housing Plus have got a really good design guide, and they're a community housing provider in regional New South Wales. I think their design guide talks a lot about trauma-informed design in the work that they're doing, and they seem to really acknowledge the need for that and are much more consultative in terms of some of the projects that are coming through. But yeah, I think there are a lot of housing providers who, I mean, and they're quite, I find that housing providers are quite open to having those discussions, and building managers, because their job is so difficult sometimes, they're happy to hear about things that will make their job more streamlined.
Yes, and possibly a smoother approach in terms of applying to council and so forth as well, dealing with planning areas within council. So thank you. We're being asked, is it true that the colour green has a psychological effect on the brain? Is it calming?
There is a lot of research saying that the views to landscape can elevate your mental health. They can make you feel calm. But I've also read recently that it's there's a distraction theory, where if you look out the window and there's something beautiful to look at, often that can take you away from the issues that you're dealing with internally. Just having a view to the outside can benefit that. So yeah, I've also read that people get most offended by green and orange for some reason. So if you want to upset a client, you make something green or orange.
Keep that in mind. Orange is my favourite colour. So we're being asked about involving particular cohorts in terms of the design process. So in terms of ensuring the building design is informed by specific needs of particular cohorts, do you have any suggestions on how and when to engage cohorts in the design process?
It's really important to engage them right from the beginning. And I think that's where service providers need to push their way into design meetings. They need to push their way into council meetings, and because their voices are the most important. And often, because architecture is such a kind of masculine discipline, often service providers' voices aren't heard enough. And I think that's a real problem, because the majority of architects aren't trauma informed and building professionals. And I think because you are, that's where we need to be a lot more receptive to things that you're saying, and also create conversations where we're explaining what we're doing, so that it's a conversation. It's not a dictation of, we're giving you this space, what do you think? It's more about, this is what I'm trying to address, what you need. Does this work?
Interesting. So thank you for that question. Thank you for all the questions. How does art assist with healing trauma?
I think art works in a similar way to views of the landscape, but art can often have a kind of memory factor built into it as well. So having artwork, I've heard in some refuges that some particular artworks can really trigger people if that's the type of artwork that they've had in their past. So it's really difficult to manage the right types of artwork. And I know that a lot of refuges work really hard to try and create consistency in the types of things that they're displaying. And I mean, that's another talent that you guys have, putting refuges together. You choose artwork, you choose interior furniture, you choose lighting, like you're making all of these really difficult decisions. And because you know the types of cultures coming through, I think, I don't know how to kind of support people in doing that, but it's a difficult choice sometimes. I think the main thing about art is that you get into a more home-like environment rather than an institutional environment.
Thanks, Sam. What are small things we can do to increase people's sense of ownership and safety in spaces where we are trying to run programs with limited funding and space?
Where spaces have good quality storage and really well organised storage, I think that automatically helps people feel like they can do things in a space if they know where things are and they know that things can go away. Going into it, having spaces that you can see out of, so not rooms that have doors that close and then you have no view. I think being able to see who is in the space is important for people who are reacting or who are dealing with trauma. And I think seating, having different combinations of seating, so not going into a room that's full of plastic chairs. Some people don't want to sit in a plastic chair, or they're really uncomfortable in plastic chairs. So having different types of seating, different types of positions that you can sit in, different areas for people to sit in. It's about that empowerment and giving people a choice.
Thank you. Yes, choice, agency they're really important themes through all in trauma-informed work, and obviously certainly in domestic and family violence service delivery, aren't they? So how do we get architects to value designing our building with trauma-informed principles? Great question. How do we get architects to value our building, our value designing and building with trauma-informed principles in mind, not just pushing us along to get the job done? This question was kind of on my list, so I won't need to ask it now. Is there anyone you would specifically recommend?
That's a really good question. I think if you build it into part of the way that you get approvals dealt with, having something that says that you need, as an architect, to check in with a service provider who will give you the value. Like, the service provider will be able to say, yes, you've addressed our needs and this is a great project, and or no, you haven't addressed these things, can you, and you work together. I think that's where the value adding happens. And I think, I mean, architects are great with difficult problems and solve, and it's a solution-based discipline where you give us a problem and we'll try to solve it with the way that we put a building together. So if we treat it more like that kind of exchange, but it does need to have, I think you need to demonstrate that you've actually had that conversation with a service provider, that you have met their needs. Because that part of the evaluation never happens. We make assumptions, and I think that's where these assumptions are the dangerous part.
And putting the service delivery at the front of all the conversations. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so we have, I believe, one of the most significant issues is having the trauma-informed projects builds approved and funded. Trauma-informed design is often not the issue, it is the bureaucracy involved with delivering the project. So thank you very much for that question. Very important. So would you like to respond to that, Sam, please?
Yeah, this is one of the things I feel really uncomfortable about. I mean, it's great to have funding to build these new refuges in New South Wales. It's hugely needed. But at the same time, the burden has been transferred onto the housing providers and the service providers to find land, to find an architect, to deliver a brief to the architect. And often these are things that you don't normally have to do within your work, but suddenly you're being asked to address all these kind of major issues. Finding adequate funding to do these new core and cluster buildings is one of the really major parts of the job, and it's a huge ask to ask a refuge provider to find funding to build sometimes 6 new buildings on a site, and to find a site that actually fits that. So I think that has been one of the things I think is a really dangerous ask, particularly when there aren't enough service providers, and the need for this accommodation is huge. And I think staff really suffer. And the other thing I think is a big problem is that the core and cluster model is fantastic, and it gives the residents the agency that they need. And we're giving staff, a separate core building, but then there's no conversation about what the staff need in that core building. And so we end up just giving staff the normal open plan offices, these rooms that don't necessarily fit their needs, and it's like a really corporate environment, but it doesn't address some of the really complicated conversations that you have to have, or the fact that there are 6 people on phone at the same time talking to really kind of heightened residents, and trying to be in a private situation, but in an open environment. So the core building, I think, is one of the really big problems that is still an unsolved.
And so that conversation will be reintroduced at, certainly I'm not assuming it won't be reintroduced in other COPs, but our final COP is, you know, examining what is the core in core and cluster. What does that look like? So we will be coming back to those sorts of points, audience. We've had a comment around the biggest concern is budget and the current challenges with building. We have recently had our other women's refuge redone with a trauma-informed lens, and it was a volunteer project from a local company, but it was very expensive. However, looks amazing. Obviously, these are concerns. So it would have been better for the government to commission and train a few of them and have them assigned to each org who has successful tenders. So do you want to respond to that, Sam? Because you know through the discussions we've had and you've been having with the core and cluster project teams, you know, this is the way of the future, and so it's bringing people along with us in terms of design and supporting those design principles and funding the importance of those design principles too. But do you want to say some more about that?
I think maybe we've forgotten to insist that the build needs to be affordable. So given that you know, if we're doing these new buildings, they have to be affordable and it has to come in on budget. And I think that's part of the forgotten, you know, we can't assume that we're doing a new building, it's therefore going to be really expensive, because there are ways of mitigating costs. And you can have a trauma-informed building that isn't, you know, incredibly expensive, but it has moments of luxury that make up for the other parts that you needed to kind of cut down the cost on. So that, you know, I think sometimes we get caught up in the way that it looks, as in everything has to look fantastic, but there are ways of making a building that's not expensive look $1 million just by having those kind of small moments. And the other thing that I think is incredibly expensive, but it's invisible, is the way that buildings need to be more sustainable. So you might get the building built, but then it costs $1 million to run it because it's cold in winter and it's hot in summer. We need to actually design so that doesn't happen at all. So it's completely sustainable and the long-term cost is really reduced.
Minimised.
Yeah, because we always talk about that front-end cost, but the life cost and the amount of money that refuge providers are pouring into just running the buildings, and that has an ongoing effect on people's trauma experience. Like if they're really traumatized and they're in a really cold building or they're in a really hot building, that just escalates everybody's experience. And I think that is a huge responsibility of architects to just stop that and forget about what it looks like, make it comfortable, and then we can start to talk about the aesthetics of it. And that's one of the problems with architectural education. We start with aesthetics, we don't start with, you know, how does it perform? Who's it performing for?
Wonderful, thank you. I do love that response. Just stop that. That's probably relevant for a range of areas, isn't it?
They don't like it at uni.
No. So what is an example of an applied built environment idea that addresses stress management and coping other than a communal space?
It's really fantastic. So a courtyard can do a kind of range of things immediately. It's really great for kids because you can have them contained, so it helps mothers know where their children are. The courtyard can be broken up into areas that are, you can have a walkway that's covered around the edge of the building before the open space, so you can really layer the sense of a courtyard, and it does all sorts of other beneficial things like fresh air and natural daylighting. And I think that creates a type of outdoor room that can extend from an indoor room, that can sometimes also help with the idea of having a choice of whether you want to be inside or outside. So there's kind of really normal things like that, which I think people think, oh yeah, it's a courtyard, but it does all these other kind of magic things to the way that you experience the building, which are trauma informed.
Mm. It does really expand our thinking, doesn't it? And so they're actually wonderful challenges. So I might jump over to one of my previously organised questions. I've got a feeling that we've maybe addressed a number of these. What are your thoughts on the training needs for staff in core and cluster, accommodation and core, regarding the importance of TI design? So what appreciation of trauma-informed design principles and trauma-informed care should also be held by visitors to the core?
I think sometimes the design can actually mitigate some of these things. So in some of the core and cluster proposals, having things like front fences so you can keep pets, obviously, but they can also create layered entry so that it slows people down, so you're not confronted by somebody walking through the property. I think that thing around safety is probably the most important, and making sure that people in the refuge know when visitors are coming. So there needs to be some kind of way of, and lots of refuges manage this really well already. I'm talking to some providers, they've spoken about the need, when in a core and cluster refuge, the staff have to do a lot more work to go and talk to the residents, because they don't have that kind of intermediate kind of crossover that happens in a shared refuge. The staff actually have to get up out of their seat and go and check in on the residents, a couple of times a day sometimes. And in some refuges, they do a walk around at night just to check everybody's in and the doors are locked and things like that. So it does put a lot more burden on the staff to actively go and check, and not just have those kind of check-ins at the front door when people are leaving. And I think that needs to be talked about in the design phase. Like, how would you operate as a refuge provider in terms of what do you need to happen so that you can know that the residents are safe at night when you're not there? Or where are people in relation to the boundaries, for example?
Thank you. So courtyards can also define mood by planting styles, open and bright, or intimate and cloistered. Yes. So communal areas, what challenges do you see arising in these spaces, Sam?
That's such a great question. I've just taken 17 students down to Hobart Women's Shelter to work on the communal spaces. And they have really recently built communal spaces that aren't working. So it's this kind of interesting type of project where sometimes we just don't get it right, and you have to have another go and have another go. And we were looking at a recreational space and a therapeutic space that were, they were quite well set up, but they weren't trauma informed, and there was lots of chaos. I think part of the problem is that because they're multifunctional spaces, then quite often nobody uses them. So often they'll be totally unused. So they're really big spend items, and you need to have a big kitchen and a big dining room and a big lounge room, which costs a lot of money. But then because everybody's got their own units, they don't tend to use the communal spaces very well. So we need to kind of rethink, is it necessary to have this enormous space, or do you have somewhere where smaller groups of people can meet? So some of those assumptions, I think, are interesting. The mess factor, having good storage. Sometimes it's just set up as a house. Again, communal dining room is just a dining room, but maybe we need to create storage so that it can be a dining room or a painting room or a yoga room, and be a lot more efficient in the way we use that one space. But communal spaces, I think we're not very communally minded now, compared to in the 70s when, we're quite happy to lob in and try and help each other. Now there's a different kind of thinking about personal space and how we recover and what we need to recover.
sorry, I was just saying, and the trauma-informed respect of that. So would you say that a good argument for providers to make with architects and designers is that trauma-informed design, like passive solar design or equitable access, are essential layers of design quality that ensures future-proofing, the long-term effectiveness and service provision of the structures? And you're nodding your head. Yes.
Yes, you call it trauma-informed design. It should just be good practice or best practice. We should just do it. Like everybody, there's so many people who experience trauma. Why aren't we just designing better spaces for everybody? But in particular for women and children in these spaces, I think they deserve, and the staff working every single day in these places, I think they really deserve to have well-designed, thoughtful spaces.
Which actually does take me to one of the questions that I'd penned around vicarious trauma. So this emphasis on trauma-informed design principles in terms of maintaining the wellbeing of staff working in the domestic and family violence sector. So you made some mention of this earlier, but maybe you could share some more thoughts about this aspect in relation to its potential for supporting workers and even its potential contribution to the prevention or maybe even just mitigation of some level of vicarious trauma.
This came out of a lot of the refuges that I visited. Staff would be pacing up and down the driveway because they had no quiet spaces in the office to be on the phone, or they'd be eating lunch down in the corner of the garden because there was nowhere to have lunch inside, or, you know, most of the refuge staff would be eating their lunch at their desk. And it was this kind of disconnect between the residents had these huge communal spaces that they could go and eat their lunch in, but the staff continuously had to compromise their comforts. And the other thing is that they'd be there 8 hours a day, but there was no off space where they could go and retreat. So this whole idea of refuge was just not the case for a lot of the staff, and I think that's where a lot of the burnout happens. Is that if you want to have some time off, you've got to go down the road to the cafe to get away from everybody. So why can't we design a room or a space or an outside area where staff feel safe to go and not do work? It's a massive problem, and I think because you work so hard and you work on such difficult, complicated, complex jobs, you need more time to process that than somebody who's working in an office job where, you know, there's just one thing to do each day.
Yes. Thank you. I find that First Nations women are often utilising a communal space over a personal space. So yes, important to also consider culturally informed design. Can you say some more about that, Sam, please?
Yeah, with Nations women, it's like we need to acknowledge the family structures are quite different, and it's really important to make that possible for more people to get together. And I think sharing happens a lot easier within First Nations communities where it's about telling stories and sharing ideas. So those communal spaces are really important to work with them on what they need to feel safe to be able to kind of hang out collectively. And sometimes it is much more about, you know, the connection to having an outside space to do that, so that you have an outside space that can be sheltered, so that you can use it in any weather, and then have a choice to be inside as well. So it's not just one space that everybody has to share, but you have diverse kind of sharing spaces and things like yarning circles. I think I get a bit weirded out by people throwing yarning circles everywhere, but not actually asking people who would be using them where they should go, or how they should be set up, or what would you like to sit on, or does it need to have a tree? We just assume, and that's a big problem, because it's not our culture to put a yarning circle in. It's your culture. So tell us what you need.
Yes, wonderful. It's the recognition of the importance of agency and participation and different decision-making process as well, isn't it? It's yeah, so okay, so do we have, thanks Sam, do we have more questions from the group? I'm just checking mine to make sure I do have another one here, but I'm also wanting to mention that DVNSW will be dropping a survey into the chat very shortly. It doesn't take very long. SurveyMonkey, about 2 minutes. So please, we encourage you all to participate. There it goes. It's just popped in. So please do that. I might ask one more question of Sam around trauma-informed design principles, council planning councils, and so forth, in terms of potential concerns around funding. This is funding related, I guess, but like once designs have been done and designs have gone into council and even been approved, concerns around some of those principles being pared back after things have been approved, as in response to funding or cost blowouts. And can you maybe comment on that for us, please?
I think the number of jobs that I've worked on where there's been no money at the end to do the landscaping, I think is a travesty. And because landscape is one of the really integral things to do with trauma-informed design and being able to, have those good views to the outside and be able to distract yourself with a beautiful garden. And because landscape isn't that expensive in relation to building, I think that we need to privilege the landscape and to make sure that the landscape doesn't get knocked off the budget in the project build. The other things that get compromised are the sustainable factors like solar panels and making sure that there's really good windows and door seals to stop the heat from transferring. So I think things like that, which automatically help the environment be controlled or be beautiful, they're the ones that get dropped off in the beginning because of the budget constraints. And then you end up with a generic house, which is, we're back to square one. So we need to be really careful about the way the budgets work. But then again, that falls on the service provider's shoulders to make these decisions. Because when you're halfway through the build and the builder goes, well, we're running out of cash, what do you want, A or B? Do you want a roof or do you want a garden? It's really unfair.
That's a really important point, isn't it? It's yes, and but highlighting, begin the way you want to finish. This is let's, from the ground up, let's start this the way we want to be able to have women and children coming into these spaces on the basis of these best practice principles and preferred principles. And we have also been, I'll just come to another question, Sam, but thank you for that. Now I think I've just lost that. How do you design spaces that are culturally safe for a variety of cultures? So we're talking about women from a diverse set of cultural backgrounds for this question.
Yeah, that was where I started designing refuges, just because there were cultures that were at war within the refuge service. I think it's about the choice factor, where you give people a diverse kind of arrangement of spaces, and they don't have to be big spaces, but give people the capacity to not be in the same space together automatically calms people down and gives them a sense that they can either choose to socialise or not. And I think core and cluster automatically helps this, because you can go and retreat to your own unit. But But in some of those big communal spaces, everybody's just lobbed in together and there is not a lot of choice. I think we can design those a lot better to make different cultures feel safe. Some cultures like to sit on the floor, for example, and eat dinner. They don't want to sit at a dining table. So, things like that can be really easily designed into.
So, that's lovely seeing that moral support there.
That's my builder. He's the best builder in the world.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I'm just checking that I think there are no other questions, so we're still here, open to is this?
Can I ask a question?
No, you can't. Of course you can. Of course you can.
But from a service provider perspective, what do you need? What do you want us as architects to do? Because if you can articulate what you're not seeing or what you want more of or what you want less of, then maybe this is a really great platform to start to kind of send that message out.
Okay, so I've also just noticed that we have a hand up, but it would be fantastic if people please jump in and respond to what Sam is asking here. We've got Tranche 3 opening up on the 27th of April. We've got planning webinars. The 3 peaks in this capacity building program are continually developing capacity building projects within that program, and so we obviously want people to stay across that. So Nav has been waiting to ask a question. Can you unmute yourself, Nav, and please ask a question?
Yeah, hi everybody. Unfortunately, I had to drop in late because of a SAMS meeting, and this question may have been answered. How do you reconcile, I guess, the aesthetics and the safety and security and trauma-informed aspects of architecture when we're looking at women's and children's safety, particularly when you were talking about common spaces, and particularly in rural, remote communities, because small towns, people tend to know a lot of people, and you want to keep, I guess, the architecture where it doesn't feel like it's, a Lego city.
That's a great question.
Keep close to budget, but also have the trauma-informed ideas flowing through the aesthetics and safety and security, because it's a bit tricky.
Yeah, and particularly in regional and remote areas, I think things and rather than putting up lots of kind of big fences and making it feel like a jail, having a really good door and a good security screen and ways that you can have the building open but have it secured with a really good security kind of gate make a huge difference to both people's kind of sense of safety but also their actual safety, particularly at night and when you're not close to town. And having you can spend money on the doors and then not spend so much money on the on bigger things like roofs and walls. But the doors are really, really important. And even just the feel of the door, knowing that it's going to, it's solid and it's not going to fold is important. Some of the refuges that I visited didn't have security screens. So women either had their door open or shut. So when it's really hot, they can't open their door because the door, there's no protection. And the same with windows. They couldn't open their windows at night because there was no screen on. And particularly when you've got little kids, you want to be able to, you don't want to have to kind of follow them around all the time. So having a door which clearly says you're not going out there is important.
And I guess you made a point about communal areas being fairly prominent in the 70s. And I guess there's the other issue about conflict within those little communities that can arise because of the trauma the women experience, or there may be some conflicts of interest that are outside the community that may ripple into a complex. So they're things that I guess in terms of trauma design need to be looked at as well, because obviously you can't tick every single box. But there's some of the factors that also can unfold in a refuge setting, even a core and cluster setting, where women may feel they don't want to engage in a communal setting because of whatever reason, or there may be other hostilities outside the refuge setting or the core and cluster setting that might permeate through that little community that's built. So I guess it's a bit of a tricky one to have everything sort of ticked.
Would it help in those situations if the office was close to the communal space so that there's some kind of checking in? Or is that then
I
really
think so,
impossible?
and I think it also acts as a bit of a gatekeeper in terms of people that might decide that they want to come onto the premises. And I know obviously perpetrators are going to do what they want to do, but obviously in the old system that we've currently got, when there's a presence of staff around, it does deter some people. Obviously not everyone, but it's also the safety and security of staff in those core and clusters as well now. That it's how are they going to be, how's that issue going to be addressed without it looking like Fort Knox? But having a building, the core close to proximity, I think is integral to some of that, particularly in my opinion anyway, in rural remote communities.
Yeah, and I think most of them are designed with the core building does tend to have the communal areas with it. But I've noticed a lot of the new designs have a reception as well, which I don't understand why you'd have a reception area in a tiny refuge in an outback community. So some of those assumptions that are being made in the kind of guidelines that they're giving you are questionable.
The reception area might be if it's a client that's coming in off the street and they might need somewhere to do the interview or outreach purposes, where they're still providing outreach services but still need a venue for those women, I would imagine, if that's what you're referring to for the reception, or reception in the actual individual pods.
Oh no, in the core building.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nav. That's fantastic. That's fantastic discussion, and just acknowledging some of these comments in the chat, Sam, in response to your question, and they kind of line up with a number of the points that Nav was making. First one being listen, engage. And help us tread the fine line between safety and openness, which you've made some comments about. For designers, but not only designers, for designers to possibly try and put themselves into the shoes of a trauma affected person. And I think this helps with understanding the needs more of the space than individual needs. The voices of those with lived experience are being listened to now. This is another way of doing that. The voices of the workers and the sector that know the women and children and their needs. It seems like we are at a point where we have these opportunities. And obviously, we want to run with them. The new refuges are all accessible for differently able clients and workers, and that security is also considered as a trauma-informed approach, again, for clients and workers. So we haven't said too much about that, but we know that functional design document certainly addresses some of that particular point. Very, very important. Accessibility is has been addressed to a point, and we've had discussions around that needing to be a deeper conversation and more information to be included. It would help if architects understood that sometimes some services who are located in public buildings like the courts need to have safe entry, exit solutions for clients that have safety issues and accessibility issues that don't require lots of stakeholder negotiation, or which draw attention to the fact that it is a need for safety. Great point. Yeah. Do you want to?
That's a great point.
Is there anything you want to say to that?
Yeah, I think that we need agenda of accessibility too, because sometimes women have prams and they've got several children. It's not just about whether they're ably walking, it's about the number of other people that they're responsible, that they're trying to bring in or out of a building. And I think that whole kind of gendered layer on top of the access issues is very rarely talked about. You're either able or you're not, but we never talk about the relationship and the responsibility that we have for other people as women.
Mm-hmm. And we haven't probably or possibly been having enough conversations around the needs of divergent neurodiversity basically as well. Yeah. So we want to bring all of that in terms of its importance and recognition for so on that note, if we don't have any other questions, I would like to reinforce that about the survey. Please do the survey before you jump off. It's really important to us. The peaks have been working really hard on the capacity building project since late last year, and there's quite a lot more to come. We want services to know that they can reach out to us anytime, email, phone. We're here to respond. It's our job. And that's what we're wanting to do. And that this Corn Cluster is a challenge. We've had two tranches. We've had indicative sites announced in terms of successful tenders. A lot to be done in tranche 3, and the peaks are here to support the services. And the organisations wanting to express their interest and even potentially tender, obviously. For today's purposes, starting with trauma-informed design principles, this has been a wonderful presentation. So excited to see the work that you do and its relevance to the domestic and family violence sector, Sam. So if there are no other comments to be made, I want to thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your interest, your participation, for jumping on, and look forward to seeing you all at our next.